Endeavor to make first contact. By Elton Garr. Commander Hester had spent most of Alpha Shift in the ready room, doing paperwork while the Endeavor practically flew itself. She felt for the 4 officers on the bridge who didn't have a private space to get other work done. But she also knew the privileges of command were important, because they encouraged people to fight for promotion. Of Alpha Shift, the only person she really had much hope for was Regan. The captain was a lot of things: naive, too trusting, stupidly optimistic, and she suspected duplicitous, but he saw people more clearly than most. And if he'd stop coddling the young pilot, she had potential. That was why Tabitha had approved her request for double shifts during the long trips between missions. None of the other pilots complained about not having bridge time, when that time involved watching 2 lines on a screen to make sure the ship didn't go off course. With that in mind, she walked over to Regan, who tensed as the commander put her hand on the pilot's shoulder. It was an odd gesture for Tabitha. The captain was comfortable with handshakes, a friendly pat on the back, or even putting his hand on someone's shoulder to let them know he was there. But it felt unnatural to Tabitha. Still, getting promoted to be the captain of her own ship would rely in part on the captain's recommendation, and learning to mimic at least some of his command style would be useful. Tabitha saw the red and green lines that showed the ship's trajectory were in the top corner of the screen, barely big enough to see. The rest was filled with a complex piloting simulation.
Endeavor, put the pilot simulation on the main screen,
Tabitha said. The main view screen flickered, and the image of an impossibly complex system that included a gas giant, 24 moons, a dwarf star, and a black hole appeared on the screen. Regan was flying the simulated Endeavor through the heart of the system with the full gravity shields up and at near maximum speed. And as soon as it was on the main screen, Regan began to fumble with the controls. She almost immediately turned into a gravity well at too high an angle. That forced her to overcompensate to keep the ship from turning more. If this wasn't a simulation, that would have put a significant strain on the engine and tossed people around the room.
Take me into a tight orbit of that 3rd moon. You need to find a Lagrange point to stabilize the ship,
Tabitha said, joining in on the simulation by taking command. Regan followed the order, but finding the Lagrange point in this system at this speed wasn't easy, and as she tried, the ship began to move more erratically, swinging out of one gravity well into another. After the 3rd swing, the screen began to pulse red.
Your engines are going to overheat,
The commander said.
I know. Let me try something,
Regan said, and she turned off half of the engines. The simulated ship began to turn, as the other engines began to cool. She nearly got the ship to stop spinning after that. With better timing it could work, but thanks to the spin when she tried to regain the full speed, one of the engines overheated, which led to a cascade failure, and a few minutes later, the Endeavor was spiraling into the moon.
All hands abandon ship,
One of the other people on the bridge said. Tabitha gave him a harsh look, but he didn't seem to notice, and so she said,
Relax, Ensign. Our current destination has 1 moon and no black holes.
She meant it to be comforting, but the chuckles from the others suggested she missed the mark. Annoyed, she walked over to the captain's chair and dropped into it. She had spent her career working with Helix biologics. People who wanted to improve. And Regan would need reflex upgrades to match a Helix pilot. But that could come later. What was important for now was that Regan reset the simulation and restarted.
We're going to need you to focus on your job for now, Ensign. We're only 10 minutes out from our destination.
Yes, sir,
Regan said, and she began to look over the scans of the planet, double-checking everything. It might make her look like a rookie, but that type of diligence would save lives.
Shouldn't we be getting a signal? I was told this was a technologically advanced society,
Regan said.
Long-range scans indicate their technological capabilities, may be equivalent to those of the Commonwealth. The absence of detectable signals is anomalous, and was the primary factor in the Endeavour's deployment.
The Endeavour answered. The ship seemed to answer things more or less at random, but it was usually useful.
The scans also suggest the civilization could be older than any civilization the Commonwealth has met. So, I think this is a good time to deploy a comms razor and assume the scans are incorrect,
Tabitha said.
Would you like me to prepare a shuttle?
Regan asked.
You're 14 hours into a double shift,
Tabitha said, and for the first time Regan wasn't visibly upset by a no. So she decided on positive reinforcement. So she called for the captain to the bridge, then said,
Regan, if something happens before the captain gets here, you're in charge.
She was the lowest-ranked person on the bridge, and everyone knew it, but if it took the captain 5 minutes to get here, Tabitha would be shocked, and the only one doing anything was the pilot, so she was effectively putting Regan in charge of herself. The doctor was waiting outside the med bay. She had spent the first 2 days complaining about having to leave behind her experiments, and then just stopped after they had connected to the pulse and got messages from Vitalis Health Consortium. That suggested Vitalis was also interested in the Intrians. Not surprising, since Vitalis and Helix would both be interested in the biology of the oldest species they had ever made contact with. And that meant an opportunity for the only other truly ambitious person on the Endeavour. Their pilot Phil was waiting. He was more naturally gifted than Regan, but he'd never be as good. He relied too much on his natural abilities. It was one of the reasons that people who upgraded their genetics were more likely to rise in Helix than those born with family upgrades. Next to him was the chaplain Edric Ulster. The old man grinned, removed his hat and walked over.
I couldn't help but overhear that you're going on a first contact mission.
I understand your curiosity, Father, but don't have time to chat,
Tabitha said. She didn't see the point in clergy, except, of course, to control the people stupid enough to believe in them. Though Edric seemed barely useful for that, since she had no idea what his belief was.
I use the honorific spirit keeper, if one must be assigned. But I'm not here to chat. I have a master's degree in xenoanthropology. That makes me the most qualified person on the Endeavour for a first contact mission. And I do enjoy a good adventure. It also may help avoid the small snafu that happened the last time you only took 3 people on a mission.
I've had a discussion with the Endeavour about that. But you can come,
Tabitha said, not bothering to ask how the Spirit Keeper knew details about the classified mission. It was a small ship, and if you tried hard enough, you could find out almost anything. But that didn't mean someone wasn't getting a note in their file. Edric proved to be a mistake almost immediately, as he seemed allergic to silence. He tried to ask her several questions about her personal life, her family history and more. When she barely responded, he turned to the doctor who only glared at him. But by the time they reached the surface, Tabitha knew more about their pilot than anyone on the crew, including what station he grew up on, where he learned to fly, his relationship with his parents, his hopes, his dreams, and his opinion on everything from coffee to the Commonwealth president. She would probably remember his name. But Edric seemed to remember almost all of it. He only stopped talking as they got close enough to the surface to see the city. This was dangerous. It seemed clearly occupied and technologically advanced, but there were no outgoing signals of any type. Not even the typical waves of broadcast media.
That spot is as good as any,
Tabitha said, pointing towards a large flat brown and green area. This was no simple frontier world or a backward civilization. Perhaps it really was an ancient civilization of recluses. The first thing she noticed was the ground. It was brown and green, but this area had no plants and it was springy. As if it was helping push you forward with each step. With no cultural context, it was impossible to tell what building was important. In the Commonwealth, you could locate the oldest building and assume it was a government building, or trust that people driving the most expensive vehicles were important. Finally, she glanced at Edric and said,
You're the expert on alien cultures. Where do we go?
He looked around carefully, then turned and walked towards the nearest of the aliens. They were a mostly humanoid species, but smaller than humans with proportionally large heads, flaps around the ear, and smaller than average mouths. Tabitha couldn't help but wonder at the genetics. Smaller size had advantages, and she wondered if it was natural. The first alien they approached simply turned and watched the chaplain while he talked to her, then she said a few words. That continued back and forth a few times, until the translator began to work. It was always tricky trusting the AI in the translators to first contacts, but the only other option was years or decades learning the language, so it was the only real option. After a moment, Edric walked back and said,
I was welcomed to their world. Then I was told the council had made rules that no one may leave.
Are you sure it wasn't a mistranslation?
You can never be entirely sure, but I asked them to rephrase it in several ways, and they said no one ever leaves. Which could be ambiguous, but then they said the Endeavour must land as well.
Great. At least this was fast. Let's get in the shuttle and get out of here before they enforce that,
Tabitha said. They could come back down with an armed team if the chaplain was wrong. No one complained, though the doctor gave her a stern look and muttered something. But as they got on the ship, the pilot said,
We're not going anywhere.
Explain,
Tabitha said.
The ship's power system is down. I can't get the lights to come on, so there is no hope with the engine. I can try to fix it, but I'm not an engineer.
Phil, stay here and work on the shuttle. If you get it started, go and get help.
And if he can't?
Then, we'll have to figure our own way off the world.
The crew had already gotten too used to questioning the captain's orders, so Tabitha just began to walk, and forced the others to rush to catch up. As they walked, the ground seemed to work with them, making the trip easy. The entire world felt planned and organized far beyond that of any human world. She imagined it, almost like a world that had evolved over hundreds of thousands of years into something beyond what you could simply plan.
I could believe this place was hundreds of thousands of years old,
Edric said, as he looked around. The doctor glanced around, then said,
Only if the entire civilization is insane. There are no signs of anything new. There is no construction, and if they're the age the scans suggest, they should be far more advanced. How does a species have enough drive to become the apex of this world, and then just stop?
Genetic alteration,
Tabitha said. There had been some discussion of altering humanity to be more docile. Not the elite, of course, who needed that drive, but a content and docile population would be useful. An alien, shorter than most, said,
Yes, but not how you think. Scream at everyone who comes near you.
You have mind-to-mind communication?
Tabitha asked.
We are, as you have surmised, significantly more biologically advanced than you. And there has been some genetic modification in our past. But that is not why we do not leave this world.
Tabitha waited for a moment, expecting it to explain, but it seemed content with the silence. Or perhaps it wasn't silent to it, since evidentially their thoughts were very loud.
Would you care to explain?
Edric asked.
When we were a young race, we explored and spread, just like you. Then the Great Culling happened. Our culture was nearly destroyed. But when the culling was over, there were still those who felt restless. They spread to the edges of the galaxy, while those who were content remained here. Those of us here learned to hide, while those who left were called each time.
And eventually, the desire to leave was bred out of the population,
Tabitha said.
It is not entirely gone. But the Great Council has agreed. We will not let them leave until the next culling is over.
You're a part of the council?
Dr. Ramsay asked.
Ah, yes. You use a primitive government style. The council is the broader sense of self of this world. An agreement formed among every mind on this world. The time of the culling is near. Anyone leaving could draw attention to us. You must stay here for a short while. No more than 1,000 years. But you will be treated well.
But we will be prisoners,
the doctor said.
In one sense of the word, you will be. We have disabled the technology of your ship, and the crew will be transported to the surface once we have built the shuttles to get them. But so long as you remain here, you will not be restricted. You may study, play, and live how you like. And when the culling is over, you will leave, or if you wish to stay, you may.
How have you disabled our ship if you have no ships that can reach it, and do not broadcast anything into space?
Tabitha asked. The man looked at her, and then his eyes widened a hair as he understood. Tabitha tried not to think about her actions. She worked on instinct as she slapped the smaller man across the face. She didn't know how strong they were, but it drew a few drops of blood, and while he seemed stunned, she ran back towards the shuttle. As she went, the world seemed to push back against her. The road, which had made walking easy, pushed against every step, so it felt like running uphill against the wind. What was worse, she didn't recognize anything. That made some sense, and so she closed her eyes using her genetically enhanced memory. That upgrade hadn't been as useful as she imagined, but it allowed her to retrace their steps.
Have you lost your mind?
The doctor said, and she pulled out a small medical device. Knowing the others couldn't keep that pace long, and afraid the chaplain may collapse, Tabitha slowed and said,
Is your tool working?
Dr. Ramsay glanced at it, seemingly to understand, and said,
It was entirely out of power before.
What does it say?
I can't be certain. Your brain is abnormal.
Then check him. He has a normal brain,
Tabitha said, pointing at Edric, who was bent over, trying to catch his breath. Without bothering to ask, the doctor pulled the hat off the man's head, then ran the machine over it and, holding it up, said,
Hyperactivity in the anterior cingulate cortex. Elevated occipital activity. That's unusual. Any history of brain implants or augmentation, Mr. Ulster?
After 2 gasping breaths, the doctor injected Edric with something. A few seconds later, the man said,
What was that?
Medicine. About your brain?
I'm all human,
Edric said. Tabitha prepared to run again, but the doctor put her hand on her shoulder and said,
Unless you want to kill the chaplain, we should take this at a brisk walk or slower.
Tabitha realized what medicine the doctor had given him. It was one of the more dangerous drugs Vitalis used. It had been created for military use and allowed you to push well past your normal limits, not by making you any healthier, but by making you not feel them. Using it on someone the age of the chaplain was just asking for a heart attack. Tabitha walked more slowly and said,
I'm trying to not think about my theory. But I would like a medical opinion on the plausibility.
Medically, I'd say that we can't trust anything, and we're alive because they don't want us dead.
The doctor said.
And relying on memory.
It will probably only be as effective as their benevolence, though we're well outside of even theoretical biophysics. If Helix and Vitalis had a merger tomorrow and spent all their resources on figuring out what they're doing, they might crack it in 40 or 50 years.
Finding the shuttle was a good sign, though it was now in a thick forest that almost entirely obscured the shuttle with thick branches above and around the shuttle. Tabitha ignored the trees. Once the chaplain got on the ship, and the doctor convinced him to sit down and rest, Tabitha said,
Phil, I need you to follow these orders exactly. Close your eyes and go through the launch sequence exactly like you're taking off.
This is only the second time I've flown this shuttle. I haven't memorized the takeoff sequence,
Phil said.
I should have brought Regan, exhausted or not. She could have followed that order in her sleep,
Tabitha said, and shoved the pilot out of the way. She then accessed her own augmented memory. She had seen this done 4 times, though she had paid little attention. But she could relive it, assuming that the council was only creating delusions and not altering her memory. She mirrored the movements of Regan as exactly as she could, right down to turning on the radio and requesting permission to launch. Nothing happened. At least, she didn't see anything happening. But if Tabitha was right, the shuttle was working perfectly. The aliens were just creating a delusion that it wasn't. Once the shuttle should be in the air, Tabitha turned on the autopilot. Or hoped she did. The entire ship was still dark, and looking out the windows, she could still see trees and branches above them.
I told you none of it is working,
Phil said.
Then we wasted 5 minutes,
Tabitha said, and she carefully avoided touching the controls. The autopilot was far safer than her trying to dock on a ship she couldn't see. Time seemed to stretch out, and Tabitha tried to remember just how long it had taken. Finally, she gave up and just waited. 5 minutes later, she felt the soft thud as the shuttle landed. She stepped out of the shuttle and found herself on the Endeavour, even though she had never felt the shuttle move, and until she stepped out could still see the trees. The Endeavour was dark, and the familiar hum of the engine wasn't there. But she ignored all of it as she ran to the bridge. She was surprised that Dr. Ramsey followed her. Running was beneath her dignity. But she did stop outside the door and smooth her clothes. On the bridge, she was unsurprised to see that Regan was still at the pilot station. Though she was looking worse for wear. Her 16-hour shift should have ended 2 hours before. Glancing at the captain, she said,
Regan, close your eyes and go through the disembarking procedure.
Regan glanced at Captain Watt, who was officially in command. That was the correct thing to do, and Tabitha still felt just a hair hurt that the young woman hadn't trusted her. But the captain said,
You heard the commander.
She wished Phil was here just so he could see it. Everyone in the room watched Regan as she flipped switches and pushed buttons on a panel that was dark with no power. The room went silent, and when she finished, nothing happened.
Would you care to explain what is going on now?
The captain said.
I've been monitoring hyperactivity in the anterior cingulate.
The doctor said.
And I expect that means something if you're a neurosurgeon.
The captain said.
It's the part of the brain that you'd expect to be used when reality contradicts expectations. Like when you're seeing something that isn't there. They were making us see things that weren't real.
I don't think they wanted to hurt us. Which is why they let us go. They just want to stay hidden because they think something bad is coming,
Tabitha said, and as she did the lights flickered and then came on, and the hum of the engines popped into existence as if it had always been there. The captain nodded and said,
Well, if they want privacy, we should give it to them. Someone send them a message explaining that our records will show that the scans were wrong, and there's nothing worth exploring here.
Tabitha likely would have pushed back. This world was valuable, and even with their abilities, the Commonwealth could likely force its will on them. But instead, she looked at the small cloth in her pocket where she had wiped off the blood from when she had struck one of them. If she was right, it was the most advanced biological material anyone in the Commonwealth had ever had, and no one knew it existed. That would be enough to get the attention of the executives at Helix Dynamics. Author's note.
First contact has always been one of the biggest and most important ideas in science fiction. And in space operas, they get to do it as often as the writer wants. I was especially happy with this one, because if you've been reading The Scout of the Endless Frontier, it is connected too, but not reliant on the things that happen in that series. Beyond that, I am enjoying beginning to be able to develop some of the characters more. And Tabitha is someone who I find interesting. That is because she, in large part, sees the world from an entirely different point of view than me, and being able to explore other perspectives is one of my favorite things about writing. I'd also like to remind you that patrons get to read the story a week early. So if you're not a patron and want to keep going, come to www.patreon.com/Elton and read the next story. Thank you. Elton Gar.